Hello again, Peter.
Yes, we're back.
We are back. Okay, so quite crazy. Podcast episode number 10.
Okay.
Doesn't seem like it, but I suppose the year is coming quickly to a close, so
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah, the book that we're going through this time is Leadership, Strategy and Tactics by Jocko Willink, and the subtitle is Field Manual. Should I kick us off with that summary?
Yeah, you can.
Cool. Okay, so Leadership, Strategy and Tactics by Jocko Willink is a field manual for leadership. Jocko is a US Navy SEALs officer who served for the Navy SEALs, and then through this training, he learned various fundamental principles of leadership, writing them down, codifying them, and putting them to the test in SEALs training and mission scenarios. Leadership, Strategy and Tactics draws on this experience, teaching one how to deal with a wide variety of situations as a leader and as a subordinate, using examples from his SEALs experience. As the title suggests, it covers both strategies and tactics in leadership. Strategy is about long-term objectives, and tactics are for dealing with the immediate situation at hand. Once having read through the book, one should have an idea of Jocko's core principles and tenets of leadership, as well as his advice when dealing with specific situations as a leader, from a broad and a focused perspective. Finally, as the words field manual suggest, the book is intended to be used as reference material when dealing with various situations as a leader. And so, while the chapters tie together nicely, it is also structured in short chapters dealing with specific advice, meaning the chapters can be read individually when needing advice on a specific situation. So yeah, that's the broad overview of leadership, strategy, and tactics. Should we dig into some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, no, definitely.
I don't know if you have any general thoughts on the book and the summary part.
Yeah, no, I think it was just interesting on how I think in the introduction he mentions how, and I think you've touched on that it's from his SEAL training that it developed this, but he actually said that he's written in such a way that it's not just applicable to that, but other parts of life. So, for instance, I think he mentions about giving this material to company owners and different businesses. And I think in some of the chapters you can see where he makes reference to say that, this is how we handle it in combat, but as a business, this is how you'd apply the same principles. So it's quite interesting how if you in any situation when you look at fundamentals, and I think that what it touches about in the introduction, that he's talking about fundamentals. Fundamentals are important in every case, but they do not relay how you solve problems in a later step, but they just equip you with the skill on how to do it when you get to that point. It was an interesting book. Like I mentioned to you earlier, all the good books that we've read, I've kind of not read most of them in the entirety, but I had with the time I had do my best to cover.
But this one is a chunky one.
It's a really long book.
I think it's an easy read, but it is a chunky.
Yeah,
it's 300 pages. Yeah. But and it's funny because I think it's almost spot on 300 pages. With excluding the contents and the index and those kind of things.
But yeah.
And I think before we go on, your point about you can have those principles but not be a good leader because they're tools in a tool belt is important as well, because figuring out how to apply them, that tactics part of so you have your strategies, but what are the tactics as well? And it's nice that he covers both.
And I mean, Yeah, and I'm deviating here, but under the foundations, there's the study bit of it, which actually talks about that. That besides knowing, you actually have to practice and go through the leadership principles. It just doesn't happen for the fact that you know that these principles exist. You have to actually put them into practice.
Yeah. Yeah. So going to the key takeaways, we're going to do sort of 3 broad takeaways, and then we'll dig into the nuances of those takeaways. We're not going to obviously cover everything in the book because there's a lot of detail in it. But yeah, this should give hopefully a decent overview. Okay, so starting with pretty much what you said, fundamental principles of leadership. So that's the first thing we'll look at. And basically the first chapter in the book is about detaching. So I'll read a little piece here and then we can chat through it. So on page 16, he says that when I was on the line looking down my gun, I was only seeing what was in my direct field of fire. Now that I stepped back and looked around, I could see the entire deck, all the obstacles, and a simple way to clear it. By stepping back, I had detached myself mentally and physically from the immediate problem, and now it was easy for me to see the solution, clearer than ever, or clearer than even the more experienced SEALs in my platoon. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those principles that naturally also lends towards business, and that if you continuously focused on those small little intricate details of problem solving and you don't actually take a step back, then you can't see the broader picture, and then you can make bad decisions without taking that broader picture into account. And then on the flip side of that, if you do step back, sometimes it can actually be surprisingly easy to make a really good decision if you have detached properly. Not always, but more often than I think people would expect.
I think just to add on to that, I think when I was reading that section, I think it's something that we hear often. I think it's just a term that he used here that kind of took a while. Okay, what is he actually talking about? But in essence, it's about, so often when you're dealing with people, let's say an owner of a company, you get to a point where people start to say that person is too close to the business and they're not making the right decision. And that principle actually speaks into that, because it means that there just certain times where you just need to step back a bit, have a different perspective to others, try to see it from another set of eyes. Only then can you see the gaps, because when you're too close to something, I think it's just our human nature. We tend to ignore the bad and just focus on the good, even if the good is minimal and the bad outweighs that. We just, as humans, very biased. And to kind of get rid of that bias, that detachment is actually quite important, because only then are you able to make rational decisions about things. And I think that's what he was speaking into, that, in the sense that, when he was, or the arrangement they were in, all he could see was what's down the barrel of his gun, But if you actually take a moment to step back, you actually see a lot more. And if there are areas of problem, by stepping back, you're able to then, like he says, see a lot more, and you can actually then make better decisions about the situation.
And I mean, I would say that it's not always that people are just positive or just negative about a situation. I think different people, different personalities will lean in different directions. But I think it's important, that idea of like, we have these biases and those biases can be emphasized when we directly in that situation. And so taking that step back can help a lot with that. I mean, there's so much to think about with that detachment. But yeah, I mean, the broad idea is fairly straightforward and simple, it can just be difficult, as with a lot of these things, to actually purposely think through it and then
Put it
detach
into practice.
Yeah, put it into practice, exactly. So, yeah, keep on reminding ourselves of that. Okay, then page 43 to 46 are the laws of combat. So these are some of the core things that this is actually, I think, the section where he talks about the fact that he was in these SEALs training things and he started to realize that there were some principles and he started to write them down and codify them. And so he came up with what he calls the laws of combat. And there's 4 of these laws. And then he has over time tested these laws and found them to ring true and to work well as a guide. And so he basically encourages people to ingest these and think through them. And yeah. So I don't know if you want to just list them out and then I'll read through like an overview from him.
Okay, cool. As James has mentioned, there are 4 of them. So the laws of combat are cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command.
Yeah. So then on sort of towards the bottom of page 43, he says here, a unit in the field by itself is a fraction of what it is when it has another unit supporting it. So this is to do with that cover and move part. And if you think about it from a military perspective or SEALs perspective, if you want to approach a target or something like that, and you just sort of run out into a field, you're going to get shot and killed.
Yeah.
So what they often do, and there's various ways of doing it, but what they seemingly often do is they'll have a single person, or they'll sort of pair people up or in teams or however it works, and the one person is responsible for covering the other person, meaning, for example, often what they'll do is suppressive fire. So they'll basically shoot rounds at the enemy, not aiming at specific targets or anything, but
just in
basically
that direction.
Yeah, just trying to get them to not fire back immediately, so that the other team member can start moving forward and approaching. And so cover and move is the principle. And yeah, there's of course lots of ways to apply that in a business setting. But yeah, that's the one of his core ideas. Be a team, cover and move. Yeah. Okay, then the next one is simple.
Yeah.
So we need a simple and distinct goal. Everyone on the team must understand that goal. It must be clear. Plans and directives must be communicated up and down the chain of command in simple, clear, concise manners that can be comprehended by everyone. So, yeah, sorry, you were gonna...
No, I was saying when I read this section, I think how I sort of interpreted it was in the sense that you need to be very clear and make things less complicated, because it's all about comprehension. I think he was talking about how can I communicate something to someone that will pass it down the chain of command without it losing
without the meaning distorted.
So if you when we work, we always use KISS, keep it simple, stupid, it's if you can break down something to that level, it's then easier for you to write that piece of code, and then for someone who's going to work on it after will easily figure out what you're doing in no time, and if there's an issue with it, then they can easily solve that issue. But if you make something complicated, it can work. It doesn't mean that the idea you have doesn't work. It's just that over time, people will come look at what you've done and will be like, okay, what's going on here? So yeah, that's what I got from that simple section. That is, how can one effectively and efficiently communicate, and like you said, how do you communicate your goal across? Because I think he speaks about that as the commander, you have a goal and you have to make sure that everyone's is on board with that goal that you have. That's how the team sort of works well together, and I think that's one principle that's important. Is that if you keep it simple, then like simple for you to give orders down the chain of command, and if they actually understand that principle, then it's also for them they use simple terms to communicate things back up chain of command.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, you don't want broken telephone.
Yeah.
In their case, like broken radio or something.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key things for them in this idea seems to be as well, we often think that in order to convey something clearly, we need to give like a massively dense, a massive amount of details so that we can make sure that the people understand it. But in reality, that massive amount of detail is just gonna get lost in any way, because when someone else communicates it to another person, they have to condense that information in order to send it, and or pass it down the chain or up the chain of command. And if you have this complex description of something that needs to be done, people aren't going to remember that. In fact, often people just shut down like after a little while, and they'll be like, yeah, okay, no, I understand, but they actually don't really understand. And I think he does a really cool thing here, because he says, yeah, keep it simple is one of these things. And if you look at what he's done, the laws of combat, there's 4 of them.
Yeah.
It's simple. It's not complicated. So it's just well done, Jocko. Cool. The next one, prioritize and execute. If the leader or team members try to accomplish too many things at once, they will likely accomplish nothing. Yeah. I mean, very straightforward.
Yeah.
If you want to do things, prioritize what's important, take one step at a time and execute one after the other, and then you'll make progress. Else you'll likely accomplish nothing.
Yeah, you end up running like a headless chicken, and I mean, you don't want that in the field of battle.
Yeah, and you feel like you're achieving a lot, but actually
you're not.
Yeah. And then lastly, another key one is decentralized command. So for a team to utilize decentralized command, it must implement the other laws. Then decentralized command comes to life. Everyone on the team must step up and lead. So, I mean, in case someone's unsure of what decentralized command is, it's obviously not centralized, decentralized. And so if you think about normally what you have is like you'll have the team lead of, in our case, software development teams. You'll have the team lead, and then people will think like, okay, that's the person who we should always be looking to, and they will always give us the right answers. And what he's saying here is like, sure, I mean, that's a good thing, and the team, the person in command should be able to do that. But ideally, you actually want the command to be decentralized. And in order to do that, you have to rely on these other principles, because if you can't keep it simple and pass things up and down the chain easily, if you can't prioritize and execute important things, and if you don't have the ability to cover and move, then you won't be able to have that decentralized command, because it'll just kind of be chaotic.
There was just a point I was I'm trying to get at with that. I think under principles, which is the 3rd chapter, I think that's page 132, it talks about how you should make sure that you do not lead a lot of people. Right?
8 to 10.
No, I think he was even small. It was like 4 to 6. But then that's like, you can get to that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with smaller teams.
Okay, in the book, yeah. But the reason why I bring that up, because he ties that span of control to the decentralized command. And the way he says it is that even though the team can be big, it's actually broken up into, let's say if there were 20 people in the team, 21 including him, then there'll be small teams of 5, but within those teams of 5, there is a leader. So he doesn't communicate his ideas to the 20. He communicates to the immediate 5.
Yes.
They are then responsible to do that to the rest of, to their teams, their smaller teams. And in all that, he even talks about how from that they can count if people everyone's together or not, because all he needs to do is give a command to the 5 people immediately after him. They then do the count and report back in the chin up. So it's that is what essentially the decentralized command is. So in essence, that you are responsible for a small team. As much as he's responsible for the whole team, he's not directly leading them in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And his example of the counting is a really good one, because if you have one leader counting each individual person, it takes ages and there's a likely chance of error and stuff like that. Whereas if you split it up correctly and you say, okay, you just count your team, then you can get a count of like 50 people in like a split second or so, and it will be more accurate. And so it's a really good example of, if decentralized command is done well for, in fact, a lot of things. It's not a very specific subset of things. There's a lot of things that decentralized command should be taking place, where decentralized command should be taking place. And so, I mean, if you think about big companies, like they can't function without a really high quality decentralized command. And if you look at them, whether they're thinking about it or not, these kind of principles will be there
naturally
in effective companies.
And I mean, you not to take a dig at anyone, but you do see companies that struggle when the owner is trying to get involved in every bit of operation of the company. There needs to be that level of trust that you, as the owner, identify what it is you're good at, what you do. Not saying you do not lead. You still, again, like he says on the detachment section of that, at the end of the day, it's about in everything you do, and I think that's the common theme, not just in the detached section, is we are working towards a certain goal. And it's about how can you effectively communicate that goal to everyone that's working under you as a leader. So, and it's the same, that as a leader, you identify those people that then lead the smaller subgroups under you, but you do not necessarily have to interact with the lowest in that hierarchy. Not that communicating with them isn't great for the company culture and everything, but when it comes to delivery or actually execution, you need to be able to communicate that to those other leaders or people under you that essentially lead those below them. And the moment they grasp that idea, then they will communicate that well, down the chain of command. And, you as the owner, you won't have the same level of relationship with everyone, so it's important to then have those other leaders that are closer to your other employees in the sense of a company, that then can know how to effectively communicate that goal to the people they work closely with.
Yeah.
So sorry, I kind of digressed.
No, it's helpful. Yeah, I mean, there's the one more thing that he mentions. There's a few other different things, but one of the other key components in that is, and I think it goes for everyone on that chain of command, ideally every employee and every person, but is the he says that another component of leadership that he realized is vital is extreme ownership. He, in fact, finds it so important that he wrote a whole entire book on it. So it's one of, I don't know if that was his first book, but I know that it's one of the books. Whenever I hear his name, then extreme ownership is the book that people normally mention. And so, I mean, there's on page 46, he says, yeah, extreme ownership is the mindset of not making excuses and not blaming anyone or anything else when problems occur. Which is, yeah, extremely difficult at times because there's a bunch of different things that he goes into, and we'll get into it a bit later. But for example, if you have someone who they under your in your team, for example, and they make a blatantly obvious mistake that they made the mistake. It's clear that they made the mistake. The natural tendency is to say it's their fault, right? But what Jocko would say is, no, it's always the leader's fault. There is absolutely no scenario where it is not the leader's fault. Which, yeah, it is very extreme ownership. And I think in large part, if you actually put it into practice and you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because, yeah, when someone takes extreme ownership, then that decentralized command can naturally work well because each of the different components have high trust because they don't feel like, oh, if I make a mistake then I'll just get blamed and things like that. It's just the leader will take responsibility for those downfalls and then try and reflect and say how can I improve, etc., etc. Not just myself, but help the team to improve. Yeah, so it's quite a extreme one, but yeah, if you want to delve into it more, extreme ownership. Okay, so then going on to another point that is made in the fundamental principles of leadership. So always letting the team have and take ownership of a plan to achieve a goal. So your goal as a leader is to let them do it their way and then giving guidance to them based on the probability of success. And I think that's also another really important idea. We don't have to dig into it too much, but yeah, if you want to have people take ownership, extreme ownership of things, you need to trust them and allow them to basically develop the plan so that they can feel responsible for it.
I think when you're talking about that that point, there's just a section in the book now I can just seem to recall where exactly, but it talks about how if as a leader, if let's say you have to conduct some mission, you do not make the decisions of what needs to be done. So you relay the goal to the team. The team then, and it's exactly ties in with the extreme ownership, the team then comes up with their plan. And in so doing, because they came up, so it doesn't mean that you do not have a plan. So as a leader, you kind of, and he, from his point of view, he said the team he was in, and one of the teams he was in, he was the person with the most experience. So meaning that he knew better than everyone. he did put it in that way, but he said, as a leader, he learned quick that if you kind of order people, it never works well.
Yeah.
So he, in that section, then said that he rather allows them to come with a plan. And he sort of has a metric to it. So if he looks at a plan, he always thinks his plan is 90% correct or 90% the best solution. If the team then comes with a plan that's 80%, to the solution, he allows them to execute, and then it goes further and further. But then if it becomes 70, he then adds his input that he feels would take it to the 80 or 90%.
Yeah.
But if he realizes that the plan they've presented to them is actually utter rubbish, then he will ask them questions to make them realize the errors, and then hopefully, if then that mindful will go back and draft a new plan that's probably an 80 or a 90, and then he'll then allow them to go on. And in so doing, people feel that's not leadership, but that's exactly in his eyes what leadership is: the ability to know what needs to be done, but allow your team to actually come to that realization. And that ties into that ownership bit, that in allowing them to plan, then they own that idea. It's their idea, meaning that when it comes to executing it, they're not executing a plan that just been relayed to them. They're executing a plan that they feel they've, taken from small thought to actually plan on paper and ready to be executed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a really good way of putting it. Knowing what needs to be done, but allowing the team to come to that realization.
Yeah.
Through whatever means. If they get to that immediately, great. If they get to it with a little bit of your input, great. If they don't get to it, and then you have to sort of ask them probing questions to try and guide them on the right path, then that's fine as well, as long as they manage to get to it themselves and you don't just basically hand the plan to them and say go forth with it. Yeah, no, very helpful. Yeah, it's and his approach of doing it that way is great. Yeah. Okay, so then part of that is building trusting relationships. So there's page 53, just a small little thing he says there. I'm not trying to build the relationship for my own personal gain. I'm trying to build a relationship with my boss, or whoever in this case, so that we can better accomplish the mission. So he talks a lot about building relationships and having it be foundational. And if you listen to most leadership things, then they'll talk about how high trust is like vital. It's very difficult to get and to maintain and very easy to lose, but it's vital in order to do things well. Yeah. And then on page 78,
just before you move on from the relationship bit, I think the power of relationships, I think one important thing that he mentioned was how, when you're dealing with a leader, we have to be mindful that egos are always involved. I think there was that mutiny part he talks about with one of the commanders that was just a pain. But he in this section then said that it's easier to kind of recommend something to a leader you have a relationship with than someone that you don't. Because if you recommend something to a leader you don't know, they see it as insubordination, or they feel like you've been rude towards them. But if you have a relationship with them, they're more susceptible to taking your advice. They don't see it as an attack on their character, but rather you helping them or knowing and trusting that your goals are the same. So that whatever you say is not to make the situation worse, but actually better the situation. Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean the ego thing is a good one. He says there on page 78, he says there's almost like a summary to that. The building relationships part, he says, subordinate your ego, build relationships, and win in the long game. Yeah, and if you don't do the like subordinating your ego, then yeah, there's not much hope. You basically will lose in the long run.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think he says it takes someone that's confident in themselves to actually subordinate their ego.
Yeah.
I think that that stood out for me. That I think, and I think it's something that I've come across in many different forms of how. I don't know if you've heard the phrase power and vulnerability.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but so often as human beings we struggle with that, but we forget that that's where we actually, not that we actually, but we can actually draw power from it. By being vulnerable, you allowing yourself to, or opening up yourself to criticism and to input. I think the moment
Input,
you vulnerable, you sort of are like, okay, this is what's going on. How do I maneuver through this? And he does say in this that people think the moment you kind of subordinate your ego, you're actually weak, but actually that's where the strength comes from. You're only when you do that are you able to take input, he says. Which is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, and pretty much touching on what you were saying, if you can learn to subordinate your ego, then you get that input and that helps you to grow. And it's one of the things that he talks about again and again is just that ability to take feedback and to take it in a constructive way, not in a, oh my gosh, can't believe this person's attacking me, I'm going to attack them back kind of way. Because that's your ego. And I mean, that's another book that we should read at some point is Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. It's one of those, so he's a Stoic writer, but he has I think it's the cardinal virtues like courage and temperance and control. And then one of the things that he also writes about is that the ego, controlling the ego, and ego is the enemy. Okay, but wrapping up that fundamental section, he has a nice little conclusion summary at page 84.
I was gonna say I've noticed you said fundamental. It's actually foundations, but
oh yeah. Foundations. But he does say fundamentals.
Yeah.
You'll see now. So he says there on page 84. Think about the fundamental principles of leadership and overlay them onto everything you see to expand your thinking. Cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, decentralized command, extreme ownership, and the dichotomy of leadership. We didn't touch too much on that, but yeah. And then he says that none of this happens without humility. If a leader thinks they have achieved the pinnacle of leadership expertise, they are really going in the wrong direction. And yeah, so he said there, stay humble and always learn. I think it's really a helpful summary of that. Keeping those principles in mind, keep reflecting on them, and realize that as a human being, and if you're a leader, as a leader, you can always grow, and you have to have that humility to realize that. It's very interesting, and it helps me realize a little bit why you always get those leaders that are like reading books and things like that. You're like, why are you still reading books? Surely they're all saying basically the same thing, but actually,
I think it's
humility.
in that same sections that says leaders are never good enough, and then a leader must be constantly improving and learning.
Yeah.
Since leadership is like any job.
Never good enough. Yeah, don't let it get you down. It's not like a bad thing. It's just like we can continually grow. Always can learn more. Okay. So that was the fundamental principles of leadership. And then the next part is core tenets. So it's not exactly the way that he has it structured in the book, although those two parts are. But this is just the sort of key takeaway. So in the core tenets, he has a bunch of different tenets. And one of them is going back to that extreme ownership idea. So we're just digging into that a tiny bit more. Not a crazy amount more, but a tiny bit more. So he says on page 151 that... Yet there are still people who feel that a bad team is a legitimate excuse for bad performance. That's simply not true. There's no situation and no exceptions where a subordinate is ultimately responsible for the performance of the team. It's always the leader's fault. And that's pretty much the thing that I said earlier. And he really digs into that because he essentially says, if even to the extreme of if I have a work colleague that goes out and drinks or maybe in his case an army guy who goes out and drinks and then is ineffective the next day, then as a leader I haven't most likely communicated clearly enough the importance of the mission that we're about to do. Or if or on the other extreme, it might be something where you as a leader haven't, if that person is repeatedly doing that and there's no, like you've tried a number of different things to correct that behavior, then as a leader you should have the ability and the things in place that allow you to remove that person from the situation, whether it's shifting them to a different team where they'll be more effective, or whether it's just removing them from the company, or in his case the military or the Navy. So yeah, I mean at the end of the day he's saying all of those things come back to the leader. It's the leader's responsibility, and the part about that is how do you take responsibility in those situations as a leader.
Just before you move on there, on that same section, I also thought that was, I mean, the title to that section itself, the exception to no bad teams, only bad leaders. I think that's where you're reading from.
Yeah.
But the last paragraph, there's something that jumped out at me when I read that. It says, while a bad team is without question the result of a bad leader, a good team is not necessarily the result of a good leader.
Yeah.
That's, it's, I think for the leader, tough pill to swallow, but it's actually very true. You can have, a terrible leader, but just have a team. Either, I'll even pedal back a bit. It talks about, I think, in one of the sections about judging. What was that? Just give me a sec.
While you're looking it up, so I think it's a helpful thing to restate that. So what he's saying is the leader is always responsible for when issues arise.
Yeah.
But the leader isn't always responsible for the successes. But if the problem arises, you should be taking responsibility. But if something goes well, don't assume that was because of your good leadership. It may have been, but hopefully it's kind of a combination of your leadership and the team working together to achieve a common goal.
Yeah, and just the section I was talking about was judging reputations. And the reason why I bring that, he briefly, in that section, briefly mentions about how, I could be wrong if it was that section or not, but about, how when a leader is assigned a team, you might actually come into a team that's already very functional. that kind of has the principles right. They're very decentralized, and let's say that they're dotting all those I's and crossing all those T's. And it's up to you as a leader, and another section talks about conforming. It's up to you as a leader or as an individual to conform. Allow the time to take a step back, the haughty touch, and see what actually works well for the team before you actually impose any of your disciplines on it. And I mean, that section also talks about the pros and cons about imposing discipline. As much as you'd want a team to be disciplined, the way in which you impose that discipline is very important. Goes back to the same thing I was talking about. If you force an idea down people, then it doesn't always work well. But you need to take measures in which to get your discipline across, for the team to then understand why that is important, either for you or for the team.
A last reflection on the extreme ownership part. I think it's going to be helpful to read, but it's a decent chunk of text. So on 224, he has this idea of saying, if you are looking at two different people and you're wondering which one will make a good leader, or which person would you prefer to hire, or those kind of things, look at these two perspectives and see for yourself which one you think you would go for. And then he says, so you bring the first leader in and ask him what went wrong. A bunch of things went wrong, he replies emphatically. The material didn't show up on time. Our subcontractors were late on completing their part of the project. We had terrible weather. The costs that cost us quite a few days of work. On top of all of that, there were some conflicts between two of my shifts, and there were some conflicts between two of my shifts. Not quite following that. And then they were passing information to each other. But basically, there was a bunch of issues, right? And then he says here, clearly this leader is not going to take ownership of anything. As a boss, you should not be happy with this attitude. You call the next subordinate leader in and ask what went wrong with her project. Her attitude is different. She says, a bunch of things went wrong, she explains. First of all, I didn't order the materials early enough, so some of them showed up late. From now on, I'll be sure to order the materials earlier. I also didn't do a good job of keeping our subcontractors on track. They were late in completing their part of the project. Next time, I'm going to do a daily check-in to confirm their progress and make sure that things are on track. If they are not, I will make adjustments to get them on track and make sure that they're not late. We also ran into some weather issues. Unfortunately, I didn't have a contingency plan. On the next project, I will be informing everyone that the days missed due to weather will be made up on the weekend so we don't fall behind. And lastly, two of my shift crews were not getting along very well. I need to make sure that they do. I will play a more proactive role next time to ensure all our teams are getting along well and fully integrated, working together. Those are all the things I'm going to fix next time. So the two different attitudes, they're basically saying the same things. Like, there was a bunch of issues but the one attitude is like, these issues were completely outside of my control. And the other attitude is extreme ownership, saying these appear not to be my fault, but actually, had I taken more of a proactive approach in this scenario, or had I been more on it with the checking in with the subordinates, with the subcontractors and various things like that, you start to realize that actually there's a lot of things that the leader could have done to improve that situation. Now, you can't foresee all of those scenarios, so it's not like the project failed and therefore you're a terrible leader and you should have thought more about it. You could have foreseen all of these things. But the important thing is to say the one leader took responsibility, and then based off of that taking responsibility, came up with what is the action plan for what we should do next time these kind of things come up? How can we approach them so that we don't actually end up in the failed project state? So yeah, I think it's really straightforward, simple examples, but very helpful.
Yeah. I think just to add there, I want to say she didn't actually imply that it wasn't her fault. She actually was like taking responsibility of everything, actually, and not only that, then kind of providing a solution the next time that thing happened.
Yeah.
Because the first guy was just like, these are the issues. Yeah, it happened.
Story,
yeah. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, like, I find myself often in those kind of situations, if someone says that to me, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, there was a bunch of issues, it was outside of your control, and oh man, I can't believe those subordinates say can't believe them. They just keep on causing nonsense, and subcontractors are terrible and stuff like that. And often we don't want to take extreme ownership of those things. But if we do, it's really difficult. But we can make progress in a good direction if we take extreme ownership.
Because, I mean, if you really think about it, that can also, going back to like the improve relationships. Because if you're playing the blame game all the time, because then you're forever pointing fingers, then as a result, you lose your team's trust, because then they actually don't want to come to you when something's wrong.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid they'll get in trouble. But if you told them like, okay, this is exactly what went wrong, it was out of my control, but this is the case. When you're reporting to your higher ups, you don't then throw that person under the bus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important. And then something that you already touched on, which is part of those core tenets, and I think you explained it well, so we don't have to dig into it, is the allowing the team to plan and those different levels of stepping in the whole. If you have a plan that's solid, let the team go with it, even if it's only 80% solid. If it's below that, then maybe you need to help out of it. If it's really bad plan, ask those probing questions. So yeah, that's another one of those core tenets to hold on to. And there's a bunch more in that section, in that sort of, because it's broken down into a few different sections with the chapters.
Yeah.
There's a bunch more in that section, but yeah. Then the next part, becoming a leader. So this is sort of the last part of the book, and he has a bunch of different advice on becoming a leader and learning how to lead and things like that. Let me go to page 180. So for that, it talks about mentoring without directly mentoring. So he says here, the people who taught me the most about leadership, strategy, and tactics never explicitly told me that they were coaching or mentoring me. They subtly guided me along the path, filling my head with knowledge while I barely even noticed. They managed to teach me without teaching me, putting ideas into my brain so delicately that I thought the ideas were my own. That's the most powerful way to teach, coach, and mentor. The best leaders usually lead not by orders, but by suggestion. And then he sort of concludes there, indirect leadership almost always trumps direct leadership. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're a good leader, or if you had a good leader in your organization, then often, like, it's almost like, what are they really doing, But meantime, what they're doing is, and I've been using this word purposefully a lot, but they purposefully are giving you suggestions and advice that guides you in a certain direction, but it's not forced. You will do this. Listen to me. I'm giving you these instructions. You must follow them. it's just sort of general advice that they have experience over time, and they impart that experience to you subtly over time, so that over time you think that those ideas are actually your own. You start to, I don't know, weird way of putting it, you become one with those ideas and you ingest them properly. And then those, whatever they are, the laws of combat, those kind of principles, they get they become foundational in your ways of thinking. And then next thing you know, you actually are a good leader or team player yourself, because those people have indirectly guided you. They've mentored without directly mentoring. Yeah.
I think just to add to that, I know I'm taking us back, but there was that section of leadership or manipulation, I think page 70. Yeah, I was waiting for it again, but anyways, in somewhere there, I can't remember where exactly. It talks about how leadership and manipulation are essentially the same. The only difference is leadership does it for the benefit of the team, yet manipulation does it for an individual's
for your own benefit. Yeah, and I mean, like, it's a lot of words. Manipulation sounds like a weird and mean thing, and he obviously doesn't mean it in the sense of like twisting someone, but in directing them, helping them be directed. It's the same. He speaks about this as well later, where the team members will naturally take on the team lead's way of doing things and their attitude and things like that. So if you have a very positive team lead, the team will become positive. If you have a very negative team lead, the team will become negative and pessimistic and that. And I think those are the kind of ways that he means. Like, he means you need to manipulate in a healthy way.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that in there. I was just adding on to the whole the reason I went back to it was what you're talking about, those mentors that lead you without you actually realizing that they're doing it by their subtle suggestions and stuff, and good that you brought that up. It actually reminds me of the story he tells about that better commander they had after the mutiny. He would always clean and take the trash out.
Yeah.
And he didn't say anything, he just did that. But then naturally they were like, no, we can't let him do that. Then they all then started cleaning and taking the trash out. I mean, it could have been him saying that you need to do this, because they were always saying they leave that to the newcomers, the new joiners and whatnot. We are higher up, we can't do that. But when he did that, they were like, how come he's way higher than us, but we think we're better than him not to do that?
Yeah.
And naturally they fell in line, and that's part of that. I mean, it's a subtle way of saying, as you imparting something to your subordinates, that as a leader, this is what I do. Naturally, those below you would do that without hesitation. That's if it's not more wrong or anything.
Yeah.
We need to have that balance. But I mean, if it's as a leader, I would like to think you're trying to impart good principles and knowledges on your subordinates. So the good things that you do, if they're very visible, then naturally, your subordinates will soak it up like a sponge and do as you do.
Yeah, that leadership by example idea is really powerful. And it ties back to a bunch of things he says, the humility idea as well. Like, if you are genuinely humble, like, you aren't the best person in the world, even though you might be in the leadership position, you don't know everything. Some of your team members might know more than you in certain situations, and you should use that and grow with them. And if you are humble in that way, then taking out the trash or doing those kind of things it's not like, I'm doing this to show them this is how it's genuinely. You're like, this is what we need to do. I'm fine to do it. And then if the your in the military terms, if your subordinates are willing to take over and help you, grateful for that, and that's great. And it's I think that's the sign of a really good leader, because there's genuine humility there, and importantly, touches on this again and again. You're doing it for the sake of the team. It goes back to that example that you were saying. The one side of things is people doing it for themselves. I want this promotion to be better and this and that. The other side of it is I'm doing it for the team. The fact that you get promoted or whatever is kind of neither here nor there. It's nice and everything, but it's not. Is that going to be the effective thing for the team? And if you are able to be a good leader, then that's the way that you're thinking about it. It's about the team, not about yourself. Yeah. And maybe a last sort of point on that in the leadership realm of things is not stunting the growth of your team either. So there's this concept of, as a team leader, you should do the picking up the trash and all of those kind of things, but you should also be willing to pick up the hard tasks to, for example, if your team is really like scared of tackling some task because it's like incredibly difficult and risky or whatever, you as a team leader should be able to step into that and show them and complete the task successfully. You should be capable of doing that, and not only capable of doing that, from time to time you should do that to show them. Yeah, I mean, it's a funny way of putting it because it sounds very arrogant, but to show them how it's done so that they can draw confidence and say, oh, okay, I can do it, and if I struggle, then my leader will help me, and they know how to do it. But you shouldn't always take on those roles, because the other side of the coin is, and he says, you don't want to stunt the growth of your team members. Don't solve every problem they come to you with. Don't let yourself be the easy button.
Yeah.
And there's that balance, that dichotomy of like doing too much, but also doing too little. You want to kind of fall in the middle where you taking pressure off them in critical situations where they're going to crumble. But if they're not going to crumble and they've got enough confidence, then you should let them tackle the hard tasks, and that's when they'll learn and grow.
And I mean, with that as well, I think it was around that same section where he talks about you doing the job so just they know that you can do it and they're not irreplaceable.
Yeah. And then there's like 3 more things with the becoming a leader that we can touch on. The one is the idea of handling punishment. So on page 245, he talks about it and that, but essentially the core idea there is punishment is a difficult thing to give out, especially if you are sort of a, put it in quotes, a nice leader. You don't want to be, and you have good relationships with your team members and things, you don't want to be punishing them. So it's a really difficult thing. And he effectively says, it's really difficult, but you do need to do it at certain times. But importantly, you shouldn't be punishing people arbitrarily. You need to have those punishments laid out clearly beforehand. If someone doesn't know that they sort of violated some rule or something like that, then you shouldn't be punishing them for that. It should be clear when they had violated those rules, whether it's from a government legal thing where you're not allowed to steal, or if it's from in a specific company, like no, I don't know, just some rule. You can come up with it yourself. So those rules should be clearly stated.
Yeah.
And if that's done correctly, then the result of that is that it makes punishment a much easier task, because all that you need to do then is say, look, this is where you failed. This is the rule, and unfortunately this is the consequence of it. And so we're going to apply that consequence, and then try not to do it next time or something like that. And he does talk about having a bit of discretion there, and it's not always like there's the rule, there's the punishment, full stop. As a leader, you need to take it to the person, do this multiple times. Is it a one-time thing, or etc., etc. But yeah, I think that's a really helpful idea as a leader, because some leaders are very happy to punish, and that's a problem. You shouldn't be punishing for every little thing. That's just it's just not good. But other leaders will struggle to punish, and having those clear guidelines is a really helpful tool. Then another one is the idea of the tactical versus the strategic plan. And so on page 250, let me quickly go there. He talks about, there's an idea in the military where they say never give up, or SEALs. They say never give up. And so some people take that too far. There's an example where they're doing a training exercise, and the training exercise is you have, say, about 10 troops, and what they have is this building, and then at the one passage in the building, there's a person with basically a heavy firearm that can kill anyone that tries to run down the passage. And so what initially happens is some leaders, they'll rightfully, this is what they're sort of supposed to do, they'll try and approach the different scenarios, then they eventually get to that passage, and they need their strategic goal, basically their long-term end goal, is to get to the other side of the building so that they can get to their I can't remember what it is, but let's say they need to help some civilian, and that's their strategic goal, that's captured and imprisoned or whatever. So they need to get past this, they need to get there, and so they'll get to this passage, and what they'll do is they'll send 2 troops in, and those troops will run down, and then they'll get shot down, and then they'll basically play dead, because it's not a real gunfire in the training scenarios. So they'll die, and then what the leader will do is they'll send another 2 and another 2 and another 2, and he'll basically keep on going, and then eventually it's him, and he'll run down the passage, and then he'll get shot, and he dies as well. And then when reevaluating, sometimes they think they did the right thing. They never gave up, even though everyone died. They didn't give up, and that's one of the key things in never give up, But Jocko is like, no, all of your troops died in real life. If that happened, that's terrible. That is a horrible outcome. Why on earth would you continue? And sometimes they even redo the training, and people still do that, the same thing, because this never give up thing is so drilled in. But at the end of the day, if you detach and you step back and that, then there's other ways of approaching the scenario and things. And his point there is, on page 250, he says, I would explain to him the difference between the strategic objective, remember that's the long-term one, and the tactical one. And that it's okay to quit a tactical plan if it wasn't working, especially if not quitting the tactical plan or objective was actually going to hurt our ability to reach the strategic objective. So the short-term plan should be very result dependent, If the short-term plan is going well, okay, cool, continue forward. If it's going badly, take a step back, reevaluate, try and come up with another plan. The strategic goal, not to say that strategic goals can never change, but the strategic goals, they are the ones that are more fixed. As a company, we want to develop this product, and that's our main goal. That can even be a tactical goal, but very different discussion. But if you have some strategic goal, then that's the thing that you should really be pushing to not give up. But the tactics, change them as they need to be. Stick to them if they're working, but if they don't, not change them.
What's important is the end goal. So do anything you can to achieve the end goal is essentially what he's trying to say there.
Yeah, exactly. And then lastly, the thread of why. Let me quickly jump over to 271. So the thread of why, he says here, explaining why is important, but why has to be tied and connected to everyone in the chain of command. So this goes back basically to the simple law of combat. So keep things simple in order to be able to explain your why, which, from reading between the lines, it's the why is what is your strategic objective? Why are we doing something? And if you can convey that really clearly, then that decentralized command and all of those kind of things can start coming into play, because everyone understands why they're doing something. And so different team members and team leaders and things like that can start making good decisions, not only because they're good leaders, but because they understand why they're doing something. And so it's like in software, I think possibly too often software developers, myself included, will not fully understand the business domain and the why a certain feature is being implemented. And without that why, you can't make good decisions. You're just sort of following instructions blindly. So that's why why is important. Yeah. Okay. That's I think pretty much the broad summary of the book. I'll read through the concluding chapter just because it's, I think, a really good conclusion. But I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts before we...
No, it was... Not it was. It is a good book.
It was. It's aged poorly.
It's
don't worry about reading it, everyone.
Back in the box, it'll be dusted 20 years from now, No, it is a really good book. And I think one that I'll go back to and kind of read other parts of it. And I think the surprising part was it didn't introduce new things, if I may. It's things that are there, things that we know. I think it's just that sometimes it just takes someone, kind of speaking into something for it to kind of have the light bulb on in your head. But having said that, it doesn't mean, even though it's things I know, it's things that I practice. I think that's one thing I can say I've taken away from this book, that we may know things, but up until we do them and practice them, do we get better at them? And I think that goes with everything, actually. We might know what needs to be done. I mean, even going back to when I was in school, for instance, maths, everyone knew how to solve problems, or the fundamentals, but we had to practice so that we know how to tackle, sums that we had never encountered, So yeah, I think we said this about most books, but I'd recommend this book.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we do choose the books, so it's good that we end up enjoying reading them.
Yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah, no, it's a really good book, and I think you nailed it there with it's not like profound new advice. It's solid, straightforward principles laid out in a good way. But at the end of the day, they're things that most people would be like, I already know that, of course, that's obvious. But then you actually look at teams and things like that, and they're not implementing it. And that's why I think he says early on in the book, look at those principles or the laws of combat, look at them, try and really understand them, and keep on trying to reflect back on how you can apply them and where do they apply, and when I applied it, how did it work out, and those kinds of things. And if you do that and really ingrain it in your mind, then you will be a more effective leader, because you're using the obvious things but you're actually using them.
Yeah.
Okay. Conclusion. So I'll let him conclude because his conclusion is very good. So he says, sort of a almost subtitle of the conclusion chapter is, it's all on you, but not about you. So he goes on to say, when you're a leader, there are no, and I'm just going to sort of jump through little pieces. When you're a leader, there are no excuses. There's no one else to blame. You have to make the decisions. You have to build relationships. You have to communicate so that everyone can understand. You have to control your ego and your emotions. You have to be able to detach, etc., etc. Then he goes on to say, leadership is all on you. But at the same time, leadership is not about you. Not at all. Leadership is about the team. The team is more important than you are. The moment you put your own interests above the team and above the mission is the moment you fail as a leader. And he says, the leadership strategies and tactics in this book are to be used not so you can be successful. These strategies and tactics are to be used so the team can be successful. And then later, if the team succeeds, you win as a leader. But infinitely more important, your people win. And that's true leadership. Yeah. If you're a true leader, then you will truly care about your team and their success more than your own. And that's the sign of a true leader, I guess. Cool.
Cool.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, James.
We'll chat again.